Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to analyze the game that Magnus Carlsen won in order to become a world champion. Of course, he drew the very last game, but it doesn't matter because as long as you win, you win. And as long as you don't lose, you still win. So we will just go finally with the game that he played in the third round against Fabiano Caruana. And this game could have looked a little bit more different than what actually happened. So on Instagram, I saw a very nice video where he explained that he would much rather be freestyle world champion rather than being the best placed player ever. And it's understandable. He just said that it's the only title he doesn't have. And now we'll see how he actually granted himself this title. So Caruana played an accelerated c4, which basically threatens to win the pawn on a7. Of course, Magnus Carlsen saw that and decided to play f5. F5, yeah, great. F4, basically just grabbing some space in the center, not allowing a move like e5 that will basically, control absolutely everything in the center. Now, c6, this is just opening up the queen. Maybe one day there will be some d5, for example, knight f6 followed by d5, and this square will become extremely weak. But at the same time, we can't just play knight f6 quite yet because the queen might be taking the pawn. So he went after e3 for e6. Yeah, exactly, for e6. He's just preparing to play knight to f6. Knight f3, knight f6, everything is very logical, knight f2, and here he decided to go bishop h5. So this is another thing. Caruana has a great control over the dark squares, and by playing bishop to h5, we might be threatening to capture the knight that is basically playing on the dark squares. So that is more or less a very decent positional move. At the same time, it's bringing the bishop out. Eventually, he might have some ideas of knight f7, and that wouldn't be blocking the bishop. Now, Caruana played d4, and white is already, I don't want to say much better, but white has nice control over the e4 square, and at the same time, it does have a beautiful control over the dark squares. So Magnus Carlsen played knight f7, is bringing the knight into the game, and as we might have seen already before the tournament, even though the rook and the king are extremely far away, the king might eventually be able to castle. And when the king will castle, for example, on the queen side, the king would be going on c8 and the rook would be going on e8 because we still have to castle the same way we would be castling in a FIDE rated game that is basically being played in, on a normal board and not this weird position. a5. So after h3, which might be threatening to push the pawns and eventually attack on the queen side, Magnus Carlsen decided to go a5, which is taking some space, eventually open up some laning potential for the rook, eventually for the queen. It's basically a waiting move. No one really understands what's happening in his mind. That's why he's the world champion. Anyway, g4, bam, attacking. Caruana has the central control. He has very nice protected pieces. The bishop didn't move yet, but it doesn't matter. It's not like the bishop was useful until now. G4, there is a very funny line. If you capture, 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 and win the pawn, which is exactly what happened in the game, at the end of the day, the queen is basically able to capture on h7. So captures queen h7. And now Caruana has a very active queen. Now, Black is already in big trouble. Magnus Carlsen is actually in big trouble. The problem is that the pawn is getting attacked, the queen is getting super active. Black has access to the e5 square. Oh, actually, some issues are being recorded. Queen d3, he doesn't want his queen to get trapped, and eventually he might be pushing some other pawns in the center. So Magnus played d5, which is now solidifying the control over the e4 square. He wants to go knight d6 and eventually knight e4. So for the moment, the position seems to be working pretty decently. Captures, captures. Now, if he tries to castle short, this wouldn't be working because the rook will have to go right there, and actually castling short would be bringing the king over there, and this is the whole thing. In this position, he started playing knight h4, which is bringing the knight a little bit closer to the game, eventually to g6, and eventually one day there will be some pawn pushes like f5. So Magnus decided to capture on d1, which is wrong. According to the engine, he should have played bishop h3, but give him a break. He's just a world champion. So captures, and now he did a huge mistake. And this is a mistake that no one would have done, but at the same time, everyone would have done this mistake. What happened is that he decided to capture on h4, and once you capture back, Magnus thought that, yeah, I played knight d6, eventually I will play knight e4, and I will be the great knight on e4 against the weird bishop. The problem is that it's actually losing tactically concretely, because after captures, not even captures back, there's rook c1 check. I forgot that I saw the game a few hours ago. The problem is that the king is getting checked. You don't want to go on the dark squares because if bishop takes h4 check. If you go on the light squares, then queen b5 check. And you're actually getting checkmated. So you have to go king d7. And after king b5, after queen b5, you can't go back to d8 because bishop h4 would be almost mate. I mean, we will have to sacrifice everything, but you don't want to, you don't want to capture it. Otherwise you're just losing the game. So king d6, and now the problem is that we are one move away of, basically getting mated. Queen c5, king there, and this is almost hanging. Queen c5. I'm sorry, queen c5. You move back. I can't capture quite yet, but then I could yeah, drinking arrows today. Then bishop h4, we might be checking on e7. So the amount of troubles, it's just getting insane. It's suddenly high. Bishop h4. Now Magnus played rook c8, which is basically dealing with all of that by starting queen c5, king d7, bishop h4. White would be threatening the move queen to e7, and now if rook c8, then basically you lose due to checkmate. So rook c8. Eventually, the move order was a little bit off. We don't really know what happened in Caruana's mind. Maybe one day we'll know. King d2, connecting the rooks. Now if you capture, I just capture back and I'm the king of the jungle. So queen a7, connecting the rooks once again. And now f5. Caruana is really going straight to the point. The king is open. The pieces are, piece placement is very weird. The king is open. We just have to start opening up the position, bringing pieces against the king, and start winning. Queen a6, threatening the queen in one move. Of course, Caruana saw that and didn't hung his queen. Now rook to c4, he's trying to double, he's trying to defend himself as much as he possibly can. Captures, the king is getting wide open in the center, and here eventually one of the best options would have been to push the pawn. The problem is that the pawn is hanging on d4 with check. So he actually captures first, captures back, and now goes queen to d1. One day he might be pushing e4 and d5, that would be attacking the king, and at the same time he might be threatening a move like queen to g4 check. So c3 check. Magnus Carlsen just tries to sacrifice and open lines as much as possible. He knows that he's Magnus, and even if he blunders, he will still win because he's Magnus. So basically, after you capture back, Magnus thought, all right, now every single pawn is, the c pawn is already fixed on the light squares. Let's just also fix the other pawn by playing knight d6. And he saw that maybe if check, the king might be running to d5 and eventually hiding on the light squares. So it's a very hard position, but Magnus is basically down a pawn. The king is getting checked, and he's just getting clapped in this position. Queen to g4, king to d5. Now there might be some threats of 94 at the same time. The rook is hanging, so to defend both of them, Fabiano went rook to f4, which is basically defending, knight to e4. And at the same time, knight c4 wouldn't really be a problem. The king would just be able to run away, just hide from the checks. And you wouldn't really be able to capture right there because the king would just get, once again, mated. So he went queen to c4, which is threatening the pawn on a2. Okay, queen g2, king e6, this is the only way not to get checked. I mean, there is still queen g6 and queen h3, and here eventually, if queen g6, if you start running back, this is now where things become funny, but the king finds a way to practically run away, and it's pretty hard to really start doing something against the king. It's just that at the end of the day, there's rook to f6, which is paying the knight, but we do not care. There's queen a2, bam! This is what Magnus saw, of course. It is basically winning the queen, by the way. It's just a skewer which wins the game. There is no mate. This is still hanging. There is no 94 for those asking. The knight is getting forked. So there are a lot of tactical issues right now against the king. So he went queen to h3, king to d5, queen to h1, and he can't really find a way to really keep attacking. In this position, he should have played something like queen h3, and then after king d5, queen g2, just repeating a little bit, bring the queen over to f3 to start actually checking with the rook. This is what the engine wants. And this is super hard because now the king is just completely open. You can't run towards the side of the board. Um, I can't really understand what the engine wants. Somehow the engine finds a way to win here. I will have to cheat and ask the engine kindly. Maybe here we have. Oh, I'm just blind. Here's queen b7, which wins the rook in one move. Anyway, so right here, after basically here he went queen to b1, which is defending everything, but now after king to d7, which the engine doesn't like, the king is just completely hidden. And after e4, rook e8, the pawn starts to be super weak. And a weak pawn, a weak king, this is just way too much. And when this is way too much to deal with, Magnus is actually quite the best, to not say the best in the world, to actually find some decent solutions to all of that. Yeah, what else should I, Magnus. So he went bishop to g3, trying to line up against the knight, but we just realized that he just lost the threat a tiny bit. Of course, we have to mention that the time control is a little bit brutal. At the same time, they do not have so much time less left on the clock. So he went bishop to g3. And now Magnus starts to apply some mental pressure. G5, where do you actually want to put your rook? Now this is hanging. At the same time, this is not that much of a problem, but rook f3, rook g4, what does it change? What doesn't it change? He went rook to g4. And now Magnus didn't capture the pawn. Because here the queen is defending, the rook is defending. The amount of issues are actually pretty big. Here, by the way, I thought about rook f3 because if you capture, it feels like it's a good trade like you capture here, but then there might be some counter checks on the other side of the board. And if you try something like queen c7, which is defending the king, there's rook f7 with the intention that if you go back, it's mate. And if you protect with the rook, I just trade the rooks and then I win the queen. So he went to do rook to g4, rook to f8, trying to infiltrate. And now Caruana played queen to b3. The problem is that after queen f1, the rook is actually eventually getting in, the knight is eventually getting in, and this is a real problem. And after queen d5, there's queen g2. And it doesn't matter where you go, you just lose the game like that in a finger snap. If you go up to d3, then you just go for a check, and it's mate. And if you go back up, I can just go for check, which is how the game ended. Because when you go bishop to e1, I just capture on g4. I'm sorry, queen g3. Yeah, world champion move. I just go to g4 and it's mate. And this is how he lost his game. He lost his game that way, and he lost, and he was just completely winning. So it does happen, but at the same time, he won. This is sadly what happens. It was a pleasure. If you want me to analyze any other games, I'm actually going to analyze some more high-level games, sometimes with a little bit of entertaining, sometimes with some educational content. The goal is really to be really talking about what's currently happening in the chess world, the good sides as much as the bad sides. Those of you following the streams know that some drama is actually going to happen. So you can just keep following. Thank you very much for today. Subscribe to the channel. It means the world to me. See you in the future. Take care.